May I have your attention, please? This tape is on Claude Monet, M-O-N-E-T, and Edgar Degas, D-E-G-A-S. Put in the first slide, please. M-O-N-E-T. And this is an early painting by Monet of a street scene that is still quite reminiscent of one of the first impressionists of French art, Claude Pissarro. There was a great change in French art after the Revolution of 1848 and the decline of the realist movement. Although they opened up the subject matter of using the landscape in their paintings and ordinary everyday people in their work, there was a new sort of philosophy as to the approach to painting. And this was both in technique and idea. Now, in technique, they started experimenting with the Romanticist use of broken color that travels all the way back to Constable with his Haywain that was exhibited in 1824, where he broke up different shades of green along a leaf rather than blending them. The Impressionists found that by not only blending different shades of green and using them abruptly one next to another, they found out that if you started splotching things with yellow and blue together, that visually from a distance they would appear green. And it gave a much more vibrating effect than if you tried to mix the green and blend it on the canvas. So it was this experimentation with color, experimentation with application, the breaking up of the surface of the objects, and also to get away from the rigid formality of the Academy, they became very unrigid and very informal. And it was as if the Impressionists would walk around Paris or the country around Paris with a picture frame in their hand, and then all of a sudden, if they came upon a scene that they thought interesting, lift up the picture frame quickly, and whatever appeared in the frame, they painted it as it was. It gave sort of an imbalance to the paintings, not the rigid composition, the rules of composition that were of the French Academy at the time. They would have things shooting out the edge of the picture. They would have the subject matter obscured. But even though they fought against the rigid rules of the Academy, with this informality, they bent over backwards, as it usually is, and they carefully posed friends of theirs to look very unposed, as we will see later on in some of Degas and some of Renoir's paintings, and certainly in some of Monet's, that they even moved trees so that they would look in absolutely the wrong place to give this sort of asymmetrical feeling to their work. Slide, please. But even most of the Impressionists were trained in an academic way. They all knew how to paint very well, but then this new idea, this breaking up of the surface, and also the presentation of scenes that they saw right around them. Monet did these ladies in the park, are called the promenade. And then toward the latter part of his life, he lived a very long time. He was born in 1840 and did not die until 1926. He included people sort of in these sun-dappled effects so that he could break up the surface of color a little bit. But at this point, his edges were well defined. You could see where the dress stopped and the background started. And in the latter part of his life, he did really only landscapes, excluding people entirely, and including water most of the time, so that this was ideal because the whole surface of water was sort of like they wanted the landscape to look. How the water, the ripples, and the effects sort of really break up patterns of solid forms, whereas in the landscape it's all pretty solid. Slide, please. Monet was born at Marseille, and so had a great love of the water. He was trained early in Marseille and did some caricatures of local people that he sold for a few dollars and saved enough money to go to Paris, where he stayed the rest of his life until his old age, where he retired to a country estate. He did become fairly well known and managed to get good prices for his paintings after about 1890. So he was a fairly wealthy man. He had this country estate at Gavarnie that he flooded much of the land and made what he called his water gardens with water lilies and bridges and so forth, and that way he could get the reflections of the waters at the different time of day. Slide, please. But just outside of Paris was this sort of picnic spot on the water. It was a favorite spot of most of the Impressionist painters, Monet, Renoir, Monet, Degas. They all gathered here on a Sunday afternoon. And this is an ideal example of how he breaks up the surface of water. Little bitty slashy brush strokes of paint laid on quickly, no blending. Once it's laid on, it's left. And you get a very sort of abrupt, shimmering effect to this painting, although his colors at this point were still fairly somber. But later on, I think that you'll notice if this little boathouse or pavilion over on the side with this little scalloped curtain is going to be shown in a very famous painting by Renoir, The Luncheon of the Boating Party. And it was at this little place that Monet had his little boat fitted up as a studio that he could go out onto the water. And some of the Impressionists have shown Monet sitting in his little boat. So they all knew one another. They all exchanged ideas. And this whole movement was sort of a mutual thing, except the nice part about it is that each one of them still remained individual. They all had their slightly different approaches that came from different backgrounds. Slide, please. This is a photograph of a scene taken in 1958, and as you would pick up the photograph, and I might say that the camera was being developed at this time and influenced the painters quite a bit. But as you would just lift up a camera and snap the picture, of course this photograph, the trees, as you will notice, are much younger in Monet's painting, and the houses have been built up considerably. But notice the painting, and then slide. Here is the painting that Monet did of the same scene. Even, painted in, I think, around in the 1860s. Almost 100 years later, the scene has changed very little. Sort of interesting to see how an artist has interpreted an area. Slide, please. On to the water and the reflections of the water. The grasses become splotches of tone built up on top of each other. The figures no longer have a definite outline. They're just sort of little white blurs. And the closer you get up to one of the Monet paintings, the blurrier it gets. Until you're right up on it, it's like a crazy patchwork quilt of color. And then the farther away you are, how everything sort of falls into place and becomes quite realistic in feeling. Slide, please. In 1874, this group of artists got together and held an exhibition in Paris. And Monet exhibited a painting that he had done a couple of years before. And the painting was called Sunrise, an Impression. And a reporter, a critic covering this exhibition, picked this title up from Monet and called the whole group Impressionists. They nicknamed it. It was sort of a nickname of ridicule, actually, because the people of Paris, very interested in their arts, had been used to, say, the scenes of David, of Ingres, of Delacroix, the technique not quite so brutal, but they didn't see anything in a simple little scene with a few squiggly brush marks on it. They were quite irritated that there was just nothing there, that it didn't show them anything. But as the painters became more popular, were not put down, the group lasted only 12 years, which is a very short period of time, and in that period of time held only 8 exhibitions. To be such a great influence on the modern art movement. Slide, please. But from a thinner wash as Sunrise and Impression to some of his snow scenes where the paint is piled on very thick, it's a continual working, a building up of tone of these quick little sharp jabby brush strokes. never outlining anything, always letting things sort of shimmer that you don't quite know where the edge is. You as the viewer have to decide how large something is or where it is placed. Slide, please. And he was particularly fond of snow scenes as he was water scenes. Water reflected light, but snow reflected color. And if you're able to get up close to a Monet, you'll find, especially in a snow scene, that the white snow is all shot through with pinks and lavenders and greens and blues. It's really a vibrating color underneath all this, what would be considered just white. Slide, please. When Monet found a subject that he liked, that intrigued him, that presented a problem to him, he did it over and over and over again. One of the series that he did was the Gare Saint-Lazare in Paris, the train station, of which he did about 12 different paintings. There's a great variety. Most of them are painted at this far end, at the stop end for the locomotives, and looking out onto the open city in the background. You have all the sort of steam rising, but even with all this activity going on, and especially later on in the landscapes, unlike Turner, there's very little movement in a Monet. Everything seems to be a little frozen, almost camera stopped. There's great texture and there's great activity within the paint quality itself, but there's no direct rhythm movement of, say, a blast of steam as Turner would do, leading your eye or shooting your eye off in other areas of the canvas. Slide, please. Monet traveled considerably. This one, he did many paintings in London along the Thames River. And the nice thing is that this is his own individual interpretation. He takes a realistic subject as the Houses of Parliament along the Thames and reduces them to sort of lavendery silhouettes with the sun rising and dappling on the water, with the barge sort of floating down the Thames. But it is an interpretation of a scene through Monet's ideas, his impression of the scene. Slide, please. Another series that he did, this one a little more monotonous because he did them all from the same place, and it is the facade of the Rouen Cathedral. And he set up his easel in a second-story window of a restaurant across the square from the cathedral, and did about 24 paintings of the facade of this church. With Monet's work, especially at this time, you have sort of an overall textured effect, that it's just as textured on both sides of the canvas, top and bottom, sort of an overall texture. He would set up the problem of the sunlight falling on the facade of the cathedral, or maybe set up a problem of, say, a limited color range or a limited color scheme to portraying the church. Slide, please. And probably his most famous series that he did was the Haystack series. He was out in the country painting the haystacks one day when he noticed that within a very short period of time, the shadows and the light and the color had changed completely so that he could no longer work on that painting. And at the time, he'd asked his granddaughter to run in and get him another canvas, which he started on another painting. And no sooner had he started on that painting when all the light had changed again. So he kept adding canvases and sort of painted on the paintings for about an hour every day. So the 10 o'clock painting would be painted on at 10 o'clock every day, the 11 o'clock painting, and the 12 o'clock painting, and so forth. And he never tired of the subject matter. There's a slight difference. Slide, please. It's of time of day, of time of year. Some of them are in the snow. But it's the same sort of subject matter that you think would be monotonous or boring, but through his use of color and his intense interest in the technique, it makes it something more. Slide, please. Another one of the haystacks. Slide. This is the bridge at Argenteuil on the way to his country estate. You always have a feeling that if you were able to run your hand over the surface of a Monet, that it would be very textured, very rough. It's very true. He builds up his painting. sometimes if you would take like a little square inch of the painting, it would just be little blobs of color that you see many, many layers underneath, sort of a textured effect. But rather than working with the painting knife, as some of the other Impressionists did, he worked mostly with the brush, just sort of with the side of the brush, laying the colors on very thick. Slide, please. He also made a trip to Venice, which many of the painters did. Venice is really a magic city. Luckily, they have not been a prosperous city since about the 17th century, so nothing has been changed. Of course, nowadays, they're having to put a tremendous amount of money to say the foundations of the cities. It's buildings built in this lagoon out in the Aegean Sea. And the buildings of the 15th, 16th, 17th century sort of rise up out of the water. But Monet, in doing one of the palazzos along the Grand Canal that you see here, limits his color scheme, but also has obliterated all outlines. Everything's blurred. You just get an idea of where a window hole should be, or a doorway, or an edge of the building. Slide, please. Then, as I said, he retired to his country estate at Giverny, and much of the land he had flooded to make his water gardens, and this, I think, is one of the loveliest ones of his paintings. And it is the trees reflected in the water. You see sort of out in the distance the breaking up sort of little horizontal bands of the water lilies that he had planted. You see the reflection of the sky that brings light down into the bottom portion of the painting, and the trees are just sort of silhouettes, shapes, beautiful shapes. Slide, please. And as he grew older, his paintings became more and more abstract, the brush strokes more broadly applied, until at this you get sort of a double-imaged effect of water lilies floating on top of the water, and then the reflection of whatever it is that you see in the water. So you get sort of a really broken up surface of the canvas. Slide, please. The first one, we see a portrait, an early portrait of Edgar Degas, self-portrait. Degas was from a wealthy family, had traveled in Italy as a young man, and was greatly influenced by the Italian Renaissance painters, the paintings that he saw on his trips to Italy. He was schooled as a young man in draftsmanship in his drawing, and as a result, he combined the beautiful use of the impressionistic color with a strong draftsmanship, which was more unusual because edges, as we saw in Monet's paintings, were obliterated. A fuzziness came into being in the Impressionist work. But Degas, with his background of drawing and the love of the Italian Renaissance, included this, and also another influence, two other influences in Degas' paintings that showed strong influence, was the development of the camera and the introduction and the love of Japanese art, or Oriental art, at that period in French history. All right, with the Japanese art, you have the asymmetrical composition, the off-balance, the simplicity of the composition, the meaning of a line in an Oriental drawing. With the camera, you have the quickness. Of course, at that time, you know, the exposures were about a minute or 2 minutes, but even this was a tremendously fast time for exposure for the people to comprehend this new technique. So Degas was influenced by the camera and its sort of instantaneous record of people going about different things. The nice thing about Degas is that his work falls into general categories. His ballet dancers, his love of horses and horse racing, and also of Paris nightlife or cafe life. Slide, please. All of the Impressionists were trained academically first, and as they broke away from the restrictions of the academy and introduced their own styles, you have, as the development progresses, you have sort of a loosening up of technique. So most of Degas' early things are fairly well defined, except even in the very earliest, you have this sort of introduction of new ideas, a slightly different way of saying things. In this one, you have a very casual look of the ballet master directing the class. The girl sitting on the piano, sort of in an uncomfortable position, trying to scratch her back. You have a little dog around the feet of the girl in the foreground. And you get, as in the feeling of Japanese prints, sort of a flat patterned effect. But then the strong perspective of the floorboards, a very simplified floor, leading your eye way back into the distance, stopped with a counterpoint of the ballet master with his strong vertical stick that he's resting on, and then lots of sort of informal poses in the background. Degas worked mostly in his studio. He would do hundreds of sketches at the ballet and then incorporate them into paintings. And each painting had the freshness that was demanded of the Impressionist painters. This frame that they carried around and then lifted up and composed the scene as it fell within the limits of the frame. Slide, please. Degas' work is very accurate. From this pose, people have been able to find out exactly, according to the height of the figures and the scale in relation to the walls, how large the room was, approximately what time of the day the sun was coming in the window. People like to do this detective work on paintings. And when you have somebody as accurate in draftsmanship as Degas was, everything can fit neatly into place. But here you have a very asymmetrical composition, a very, at first glance, an unbalanced composition that you would have never seen in the earlier French paintings. Here, a dancer is obviously auditioning, and it is just slightly before the audition is to begin, maybe the entrance bow. The ballet master, with his hand raised, is about to start the procedure, and the violinist, the bow resting in his right hand, has not lifted the violin yet, or just has lifted the violin to his chin to begin playing for the audition. But here you have this counterplay. It's almost like Vermeer's Artist in his Studio. You have this sort of electric space between the single ballet dancer and the whole group of people on the right-hand side. Another a little electric bit of space in Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel, the space between the finger of Adam and the finger of God. I'll do this many times, this sort of bouncing back and forth, this void that your eyes continually bounce back and forth to the two poles. But you have other little things that make this composition not as unbalanced as it may seem at first. Notice the practice bar in the background neatly flows right into the eyes of the ballet dancer, the single person. Also, the chair is very neatly placed, and it is parallel to the wall behind it, where the windows were to allow the light in this room. But the chair just sort of, as your eye slips down the leg of the ballet dancer in the lower right-hand corner, it bounces over to the chair, and then your eye is zoomed right up into the single figure of the ballet dancer on the left-hand side, through the bar, over to the heavy group, and your eyes continually sort of moved around and around in this composition. Degas' colors at this time were fairly somber, cool, so pale whites and pale greens, more grade tones than he used later on. Slide, please. This is also in a practice hall of the opera in Paris, where Degas did many of his sketches. And this is more impressionistic, but still, you have the same sort of casual, instant poses. The people are completely unaware. He was often nicknamed the keyhole artist because they are sort of intimate scenes, catching people in unguarded moments. And he did this composition several times over. Also, the casualness of the composition of the Impressionists, of the stairway sort of being pushed off the edge of the page, off the edge of the composition. the feet as the dancers come down the circular iron stairway from the dressing rooms above. Slide, please. Here is another early one in the same sort of cool green tones. And again, it is sort of the electricity between the violinist and the dancer who is obviously practicing over on the right-hand side. But again, we have the nice composition that dominates the painting. You see the ballet dancer because the white attracts the eye. Then through her head, you go to the dancer leaning over in the background around the mirror. The dancer on the left side of the mirror conveniently has her arm placed high on the mirror so that from the arch you just slip right down one arm through her shoulders, down the other arm to the violinist. And here you have the large void of black of the piano, the black of his coat, and even the black of his hat, pierced nicely by the white music that is carefully placed into his top hat, that catches your attention, that slips you down to his violin case, that is so conveniently aimed right at the dancer's foot, who is turned in the right direction, and then right back up the dancer again. So again, you have this compositional device that keeps your eye moving around and around the figure. Yet at first glance, it is such a casual pose.